They called her Band-Aid, a useless burden on an elite SEAL team. But when a ghost sniper pins the squad down in a frozen hellscape, the arrogant operators freeze. Thermal tech is useless. 2 men are bleeding out. As the team prepares for a suicide charge, the quiet medic drops her gauze and picks up a Timberwolf, 38, 1 shot, 1 kill. The SEALs didn't just find a medic, they just rediscovered the deadliest sniper instructor they ever ignored. Here is why you should never mistake silence for weakness. From wherever you're watching, let us know in the comments. And if this story has earned you respect, click like so others can find it too. The wind howling across the desolate expanse of the tarmac at Bagram Airfield was not merely a weather pattern, but a physical assault, a relentless and biting force that cut through layers of thermal gear and scoured exposed skin with the ferocity of a living thing. Yet for Staff Sergeant Elena Vance, the cold was not the enemy to be fought, but merely a condition of existence to be endured, a constant and grounding reminder that comfort was a luxury she had forfeited long ago, in favor of a life defined by utility and silence. She stood by the rear ramp of the C-130 Hercules, her breath pluming in thick white clouds before her face, her eyes fixed on the gray horizon where the jagged teeth of the mountains met the leaden sky, a landscape that promised nothing but hardship. To the men moving around her, she was less than a shadow. She was a necessary burden, a logistical requirement, a box to be checked on a mission manifest that mandated medical support for a high-risk extraction operation in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. They were SEALs, a tight-knit brotherhood of elite operators who moved with the fluid and predatory grace of apex predators, their gear worn with the ease of a second skin, their banter sharp and exclusionary, a private language of inside jokes and shared trauma that built an invisible but impenetrable wall around them which no outsider could hope to breach, and certainly not a female medic attached at the last minute. Elena did not try to breach it, nor did she resent it, for she understood the mechanics of their bond better than they could possibly imagine. She stood with her hands clasped loosely behind her back, her posture perfect and unyielding against the wind. Her medical ruck settled near her boots with precision placement, watching as they loaded the final crates of equipment with a chaotic efficiency. She could feel their eyes on her occasionally, not with interest or attraction, but with a dismissal that was far more painful than open hostility because it erased her personhood entirely. To them, she was the Band-Aid, a derogatory nickname she had heard whispered in the mess hall when they thought she wasn't listening, a liability who would slow them down when the snow got deep and the air got thin, a frantic civilian in a uniform who would need saving the moment the bullets started flying. One of the operators, a towering man with a thick beard that was already frosting over from the condensation of his breath, brushed past her, his shoulder checking hers with enough force to make her stumble slightly, though she caught herself instantly, her boots finding purchase on the icy concrete with a practiced shift of weight. "Watch your step, Doc," he muttered, not looking back, his voice dripping with a condescending concern that was worse than an insult because it implied incompetence. "Don't want you twisting an ankle before we even get to the LZ. We don't have space to carry you." A ripple of low laughter moved through the group, a rumble of amusement that excluded her completely. Elena said nothing. She did not glare, she did not retort. She did not offer a witty comeback to prove she was one of the boys. She simply adjusted the strap of her pack and resumed her vigil, her face a mask of absolute calm. She knew this game. She had played it her entire career. The assumption that because she carried a trauma kit instead of a belt-fed machine gun she was soft, the belief that because she was quiet she was weak, the certainty that because she was a woman in a world of hardened men she was there to be protected rather than to fight. They were wrong, fundamentally and dangerously wrong, but she would not tell them they were wrong because words were useless against the armor of arrogance. Only results could pierce it, and even then, sometimes the truth was too heavy for small minds to carry, so she saved her energy for the mountain. The flight to the drop zone was a study in isolation, the drone of the engines drowning out all but the loudest conversations, leaving Elena alone with her thoughts in the dim red light of the cargo hold that turned everyone's faces into grotesque masks of shadow and crimson. The SEALs sat in a tight circle, checking weapons, adjusting optics, their movements synchronized and efficient, a machine preparing for war, checking each other's harnesses with rough familiarity. They ignored her completely, leaving her on the periphery of the bay, seated on a canvas-strap bench that vibrated with every shudder of the aircraft as it punched through the turbulence. She watched them, not with envy or intimidation, but with a clinical detachment, analyzing their gear, their demeanor, their readiness levels. She noted the way the team leader, a lieutenant named Miller, kept rubbing a specific spot on his left shoulder, a tell of an old rotator cuff injury he was trying to hide from his men and his command. She saw the way the youngest operator, the one they called Tex, was tapping his foot rhythmically against the metal floor, a sign of nervous energy that could be fatal in a stealth insertion if not burned off. She saw everything. It was her job to see everything, because a medic who missed details was a medic who lost patience. While they checked their rifles, she checked the environment, the variables, the human element that was always the first thing to break under pressure. She reached down and touched the side of her own pack. Not the medical kit, but the hard case secured beneath it. A piece of equipment that was not on the standard manifest for a medic, and one she had packed with her own hands. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. The weight of it was familiar, a grounding presence in the chaos of the mission, a reminder of who she had been before she became who she was now. She closed her eyes, letting the vibration of the plane seep into her bones, slowing her heart rate, regulating her breathing, entering the state of calm that had kept her alive when louder, stronger men had panicked and died in mud-choked ditches in forgotten valleys. The voice of the loadmaster crackled over the headset. 2 minutes to drop, and the cabin sprang to life with the sudden violence of a coiled spring releasing. The SEALs stood up, hooking up static lines, checking each other's chutes, the energy shifting from relaxed arrogance to focused intensity. Miller looked at her then, really looked at her for the first time, his eyes cold and assessing under the red tactical lights. "Stay close to the rear, Vance," he shouted over the wind noise as the ramp began to lower, revealing a swirling vortex of snow and darkness that looked like the mouth of a hungry god. "If you fall behind, we don't stop. You understand? The mission comes first. We aren't dragging you." It was a warning, a threat wrapped in protocol, a clear statement that she was considered an expendable asset. Elena met his gaze, her face a mask of calm, her eyes revealing nothing of the fire that burned beneath the ice. "Understood, sir," she said, her voice steady, betraying nothing, carrying no tremor of fear. She didn't tell him that she had done this jump a dozen times in conditions worse than this. She didn't tell him that she had been the one to patch up the survivors of a failed extraction in the Hindu Kush, when the mission-first mentality had gotten an entire squad wiped out because they ignored the weather. She simply nodded, checked her altimeter, and waited for the green light. When she jumped, she didn't scream, she didn't flail. She fell into the void with the silence of a stone dropped into a deep well, her body stabilizing instantly in the slipstream, a professional doing a job that no one believed she could do, vanishing into the freezing dark. The landing zone was a nightmare of jagged rocks and waist-deep snow, the wind howling like a banshee through the ruins of an old Soviet-era outpost that clung to the side of the mountain like a diseased limb, the skeletons of rusted vehicles buried under decades of ice. The team rallied quickly, burying their chutes and moving into a defensive perimeter, their night vision goggles turning the world into a green-tinted hellscape of shadows and light. Elena moved with them, her steps placing perfectly into the footprints of the man in front of her, minimizing her trail, her breathing controlled despite the thinning air at 12,000 feet. They moved for hours, a grueling hump through terrain that fought them for every inch, the snow crust breaking under their weight, the incline steep enough to burn the lungs of an Olympic athlete. The cold was absolute, a physical weight that pressed against their chests, freezing water in canteens and stiffening fingers inside gloves until they felt like clumsy wooden appendages. Through it all, the SEALs maintained a pace that was designed to break the weak, a subtle test for the outsider in their midst, pushing harder than tactical necessity required just to see if she would fall out. Every time they stopped for a security halt, eyes would flicker back to her, expecting to see her doubled over, gasping, pleading for a break, eyes wet with tears of exhaustion. Every time they found her standing alert, her weapon scanning her sector, her chest heaving rhythmically but without distress, her face set in a look of grim determination. It seemed to annoy them, this refusal to play the victim. Tex, the young operator, whispered something to the man next to him, a joke about robotic nurses and checking her batteries, and a stifled laugh drifted back on the wind. Elena ignored it. She did not care about their approval, she cared about the mission. Her focus was on the ridgeline above them, on the way the snow didn't look quite right on the eastern slope, on the lack of bird life in a valley that should have had scavengers, on the unnatural silence that hung over the pass. Something was wrong. The silence of the mountain was too heavy, too curated, as if the mountain itself was holding its breath. "Lieutenant," she said softly into her comms, breaking radio silence for the first time in 3 hours, her voice crisp and low. "Movement pattern on the ridge. 4 o'clock high. The snow is disturbed in a linear pattern that suggests drag." Miller's voice came back instantly, sharp and dismissive, tinged with the irritation of a man interrupted by a subordinate he didn't respect. "Negative, Vance. We have thermal on that ridge. It's cold. You're seeing wind ghosts. Keep your eyes on your sector and off the tactical calls, stick to the medical gear." The rebuke was public, broadcast to the whole team, a reminder of her place in the hierarchy. She was the medic. She was there to fix holes, not identify threats. Elena tightened her grip on her rifle, her instincts screaming that he was wrong, that the thermal wouldn't pick up a ghillie suit designed to mask heat signatures, a technology she knew was in play in this region because she had studied the intel reports they had glossed over. But she held her tongue, relying on discipline and chain of command, those chains that bound her, and she would not break them until the moment demanded it. They reached the target building, a dilapidated radar station half buried in an avalanche, just as the first gray light of dawn began to bleed over the peaks, turning the snow the color of bruised iron. The plan was a simple snatch and grab, secure the intel from the server room and extract. The team breached the main door with practiced efficiency, flowing into the dark interior like oil, clearing corners, checking angles, their boots crunching on broken glass and debris. Elena was left at the rear guard, positioned near the entrance, her view restricted to the snowy approach they had just covered, tasked with watching their back. She waited, the cold seeping into her stationary limbs. The radio chatter was efficient. "Room clear. Server secure. Downloading." It was going too smoothly. The rhythm was too perfect. The feeling in her gut, the one that felt like cold iron, twisted tighter. Then, the world exploded. It wasn't a bomb, but a sound that was almost worse. The distinct, wet crack of a high-velocity round impacting flesh, followed by the thunderclap of the shot echoing off the canyon walls, magnified by the acoustics of the valley. "Man down! Man down! Contact front!" The radio dissolved into chaos. Miller was screaming orders. Gunfire erupted from the team, a deafening crescendo of automatic weapons pouring fire into the darkness of the main hall, suppressing a target they couldn't see. Elena didn't freeze. She didn't hesitate. She moved. She abandoned her post at the door and sprinted toward the sound of the screaming, sliding on the debris-littered floor, dropping to her knees beside the fallen operator. It was Tex. He was writhing on the ground, a massive wound in his thigh where the femoral artery had been nicked, blood pumping out in bright arterial spurts that steamed in the freezing air, painting the gray concrete in vivid red. "Cover me!" she yelled, her voice cutting through the noise with a command authority that startled the men nearest to her, a tone they hadn't heard from her before. She ripped open her kit, her hands moving with a blur of speed and precision, applying a tourniquet, packing the wound with combat gauze, her mind shutting out the gunfire, the shouting, the fear. She was a mechanic of the flesh, and this was her engine to fix. "He's stable," she shouted seconds later, dragging Tex behind a concrete pillar with a strength that belied her size. "But we can't move him yet. If I release pressure, he bleeds out." Miller slid in beside her, his face pale, his eyes wide with the shock of the ambush. "Where is it coming from?" he yelled over the roar of the M4s. "We can't see the shooter. Thermals are useless. We're shooting at ghosts." The team was pinned. Rounds were chewing up the concrete around them, pinning them in the center of the room, keeping them from the exits. The enemy sniper was good, incredibly good, surgically precise. He was shooting through the tiny gaps in the boarded-up windows, moving after every shot, a ghost in the machine, dissecting them one by one. Another SEAL grunted and spun around, his shoulders shattered by a round that punched through his body armor like paper. "Doc, Jenkins is hit." Panic, the silent killer of elite units, began to set in, fraying the edges of their discipline. The SEALs were aggressive. Direct action warriors, they were used to closing with and destroying the enemy with overwhelming violence of action. They were not used to being hunted by something they couldn't see, by a math problem they couldn't solve with explosives. They were firing blindly, wasting ammunition, their shouts becoming more frantic, the smell of cordite and copper blood filling the air. "We need to move," Miller yelled, his voice cracking. "Pop smoke. We're bugging out, grab the wounded." "You can't," Elena said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it was hard as diamond, cutting through his panic. She looked at Miller, her eyes locking onto his, holding him in place. "If you move into the open, he'll kill you all. He's baiting you. He wants you to run, he's hurting you." Miller stared at her, adrenaline making his hands shake, his face contorted with stress. "You're a medic, Vance. Do your job and patch them up. I make the tactical calls. Your tactical call is going to get us killed," she said, and for the first time she stood up. Not fully, but enough to look over the barrier, exposing herself to the threat. She wasn't looking at the enemy. She was looking at the geometry of the room, analyzing the angles. She watched the dust motes dancing in the shafts of light. She watched the angle of the ricochets sparking off the steel beams. She listened to the timing of the shots. Crack. 3 seconds. Crack. It was a rhythm, a breathing cycle, a human heart beating behind the scope. She looked at the heavy sniper rifle that Jenkins had dropped when he was hit. It was a MK-13 Mod 5, a precision instrument that was currently useless lying in the dust. "Give me the rifle," Elena said. Miller looked at her as if she had lost her mind, his mouth opening to shout her down. "What? Give me the rifle," she repeated, and this time she didn't wait for permission. She reached over and grabbed the weapon, checking the chamber and adjusting the scope in one fluid motion that spoke of thousands of hours of muscle memory. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Miller roared, reaching for her to pull her back. She slapped his hand away with a sharp crack. "He's not outside," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, her eyes never leaving the upper reaches of the room. "He's in the ventilation shaft. 3rd tier. He's shooting through the internal grates. That's why you have no thermal on the ridge. He's inside the building with us, breathing our air." The realization hit Miller like a physical blow, stripping the arrogance from his face. He froze, his mind racing to catch up. Elena didn't wait. She slid away from the pillar, moving into the open, but low, crawling on her stomach through the debris, ignoring the bullets that snapped inches above her head, trusting her read of the sniper's rhythm. She was no longer the medic. She was the hunter. She remembered the training she had never spoken about, the years spent in the long grass of classified locations, the patience of a stone, the math of death. She reached a pile of rubble that gave her an angle on the upper vents, a stable firing platform. She slowed her breathing, dropping her heart rate until she was a statue. She closed her eyes for a second, visualizing the shot, the trajectory, the drop. The enemy sniper was good, but he was arrogant. He thought he was shooting fish in a barrel. He didn't know there was a shark in the water. She opened her eyes, settled the crosshairs on the darkness of the 3rd ventilation grate. Nothing, just shadow. But she waited. She knew he would move. He had to eject the brass. Wait, breathe. A tiny flash of movement, the glint of a lens catching a stray beam of light. That was all she needed. Elena exhaled, a long, slow breath that emptied her lungs, creating a momentary pause in her body's natural tremors, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, a familiar and violent kick. The sound was deafening in the enclosed space. High above them, there was a wet thud, followed by the clatter of a Dragunov rifle falling from the vents and crashing onto the catwalk below, echoing like a gavel striking a desk. Then silence. Absolute, ringing silence. No more shots, no more shouting. Just the sound of the wind outside and the groans of the wounded. Elena didn't celebrate. She didn't cheer. She didn't pump her fist. She immediately safetied the rifle, placed it gently on the ground, and crawled back to Jenkins. "Pressure dressing needs to be tightened," she said calmly, her hands already covered in blood, returning to her work as if she hadn't just saved the entire team from execution. The SEALs stood slowly, coming out from behind cover, their guns trained on the vent, but there was no movement. The threat was gone. Miller walked over to the vent, looking up at the dead sniper hanging halfway out of the grate, a lifeless rag doll, then looked down at the rifle Elena had used, then at Elena herself. She was busy checking Tex's vitals, her head down, her focus absolute. She didn't look up for praise. She didn't look up for validation. She was just doing the job. The extraction was a blur of activity, but the dynamic had shifted tectonically. The hierarchy had been shattered and rebuilt in seconds. When they moved Tex to the stretcher, the SEALs didn't order her out of the way. They asked her where to grab, their voices deferential. When they moved through the snow back to the LZ, they didn't put her at the rear. Miller gestured for her to take the slot behind point, a position of trust, a position for a shooter. They didn't joke, they didn't whisper. The silence on the flight back was different this time. It wasn't the silence of exclusion. It was the heavy, reverent silence of men who had been forced to reevaluate their entire worldview. The silence of a lesson learned the hard way. Back at the base, inside the debriefing room, the atmosphere was thick with tension, the fluorescent lights humming over the exhausted team. The commanding officer, a battle-hardened commander named Sterling, sat at the head of the table, reading the after-action report, his brow furrowed. He looked up, his eyes scanning the faces of his best men, looking for an explanation. "So," Sterling said, his voice gravelly, "you're telling me that a logistics failure led to the ambush?" Miller cleared his throat, standing up, his face bruised and tired, stripped of his earlier bravado. "No, sir, it wasn't a failure of logistics. It was a failure of intelligence on my part." He paused, looking directly at Elena, who was sitting in the back corner staring at her hands, trying to disappear back into the woodwork. "We were suppressed. We had no solution. The target was neutralized by Staff Sergeant Vance." Sterling raised an eyebrow, surprised. "The medic? She returned fire?" "No, sir," Miller said, his voice firm, correcting the record for history, ensuring the truth was spoken. "She didn't just return fire. She identified a threat position that 5 SEALs missed. She utilized a precision weapon to eliminate a fortified sniper at a distance of 200 meters, inside a structure, with a single round, while simultaneously managing 2 critical casualties. The room went dead quiet. Sterling looked at Elena. "Is this true, Sergeant?" Elena stood up slowly. She didn't puff out her chest. She didn't smile. "I neutralized the threat to ensure patient safety, sir," she said simply. "It was necessary for extraction." Miller shook his head, a small, incredulous laugh escaping him. "Necessary. She calls it necessary." He turned to the commander. "Sir, I checked her file on the flight back. The redacted parts. The parts we didn't bother to ask about because we were too busy making jokes." He looked around at his team, his eyes demanding they listen. Vance wasn't just a medic. Before she transferred to Medical Corps, she was the lead instructor at the Fort Benning Sniper School. She holds the record for the longest confirmed hit in her previous unit. She traded the rifle for a med kit because she wanted to save lives instead of take them, and we treated her like she didn't know which end of the gun the bullets came out of. The shame in the room was palpable, a physical weight on the shoulders of every man present. The men who had laughed at her, who had mocked her, looked at the floor, at the table, anywhere but at her, realizing the depth of their arrogance. They had judged a book by its cover, and that book had just saved their lives. Miller walked over to where Elena stood. He didn't offer a handshake. That would have been too casual, too easy. He stopped 3 feet in front of her and snapped to attention, his back straight, his eyes locked on hers. Slowly, deliberately, he raised a salute. It wasn't a protocol salute required by rank. It was a warrior's salute, an acknowledgement of a peer. One by one, the other SEALs stood. Jenkins, his arm in a sling. The others, battered and bruised. They all stood and saluted the woman in the back of the room. Elena hesitated for a fraction of a second, feeling the weight of the moment. She felt the lump in her throat, the burning behind her eyes that she would never let them see. This was the moment. The vindication. The proof that her silence had been strength, that her dignity had been a weapon. She returned the salute, crisp and perfect. "Thank you, gentlemen," she said, her voice soft but filling the room with its quiet power. "But we still have gear to clean." She dropped the salute, picked up her bag, and walked out of the room. She didn't wait for the applause. She didn't need it. She walked out into the cold night air, the wind biting at her face again, But this time, it didn't feel cold. It felt fresh. She was invisible no longer. She was seen. And more importantly, she knew that the next time she walked onto a tarmac, no one would dare look past her. The invisible professional had spoken, and her voice was the sound of a single, perfect shot in the dark, echoing forever in the minds of the men who had underestimated her.